The alarm on my console screamed before I even opened my eyes. I was still half asleep in my chair on the observation deck when the whole ship shook from a shockwave that came from somewhere far ahead of us. My name is Ves Karathi, and I was the only outsider allowed to watch what happened next, because someone from my side had to see it with their own eyes and report back, or nobody would believe it. For 111 years, my people had been dying in this war. Not slowly, not quietly, whole fleets vanished in a single day. Entire planets went silent overnight, their lights switched off forever. We had grown so used to loss that we no longer flinched when the death counts came in each morning. That is what a war looks like when it never ends. It stops feeling like tragedy and starts feeling like weather. The enemy we fought was called the Drathnull. They were patient, disciplined, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. They fought with a code of honor so strict that it had become a weapon in itself. They did not retreat. They did not surprise you. They marched forward in perfect formation, generation after generation, and ground down anyone foolish enough to stand in their path. We had tried everything. Bigger fleets, smarter weapons, braver pilots. Nothing worked because we were still playing their game, on their terms, in the same battlefield they had chosen a century ago. Then, 6 hours ago, the humans arrived. I want to be honest with you, nobody in the coalition wanted them here. Humanity was young. Their ships were smaller than ours. Their weapons were, on paper, weaker. They had never fought a war like this one, a war that stretched across galaxies and generations. When our leaders finally swallowed their pride and asked humanity for help, I expected excuses. I expected delay. Instead, their fleet admiral, a calm woman named Claire Whitfield, looked at the request for less than a minute before giving her answer. She said yes before I even finished explaining the danger. That should have been my first warning that something about these people was different. I sat in the briefing room 3 days ago, watching human officers prepare for battle in a way that made no sense to me. They did not study the enemy's greatest weapons. They did not memorize the Drathnull's proud old battle formations, the ones every species in the coalition had learned to fear and respect. Instead, they asked one strange question, over and over again, in different words each time. Where does their fuel come from? Where does their food come from? Where do their supply ships travel, and how do they get there? I remember laughing quietly to myself, thinking these humans did not understand this war at all. In 111 years, nobody had ever seriously studied the enemy's supply lines, because nobody had ever gotten close enough to matter. The war was always fought at the front, ship against ship, honor against honor. That was the only battlefield any of us knew. A young human officer named Daniel Ashford pulled up a star map that I recognized instantly. It showed a narrow stretch of space called the Thren Corridor, the single path through which almost every piece of Drathnull war equipment traveled from their home worlds to their front lines. Every commander in the coalition had studied that corridor at some point and reached the same conclusion. It was too well guarded. Attacking it would cost more lives than it could ever save. Daniel Ashford tapped the map and said something that I did not understand until much later. He said, "This is the whole war." I asked how long his people needed to prepare an attack on a target that heavily defended. Admiral Whitfield checked the time on her wrist without even looking up. She said, "We already started." I did not sleep that night. How could I? I kept replaying her words in my mind, wondering what kind of commander sends her fleet into motion before finishing a conversation about strategy. I had spent my whole career studying patience, discipline, and careful planning. The humans seemed to skip past all of that and simply act, as if hesitation itself was the true enemy. At exactly 6 in the morning by fleet time, 31 human ships dropped out of transit space at the edge of the Thren Corridor. 31. I gripped the arm of my chair so hard I felt it crack beneath my claws. I had personally witnessed coalition fleets of 400 ships shatter against that same defensive line. 31 ships was not an attack force. It was a funeral procession waiting to happen. Except they did not attack the main defensive line at all. 11 of their ships peeled away toward what our star charts listed as an old, abandoned mining field, a scattered cluster of broken rock that nobody in the coalition had bothered to study in decades. It was marked on every map I had ever seen as empty space, worthless and forgotten. I later learned that human scanning drones had spent 6 quiet years secretly recording that same field because their analysts suspected it was something else entirely, not empty rock. A hidden storage depot disguised inside debris so ordinary that nobody thought to look twice. The remaining 20 ships did something I had never once seen an Allied fleet attempt against the Drathnull. They did not form a battle line to trade fire the way every species before them had done for a century. Instead, they moved in a tight, narrow formation, almost like a blade cutting through fabric, heading straight past the enemy's main defensive fleet toward a small, quiet structure floating at the heart of the corridor. It was their communication relay station, the single point that coordinated Drathnull fleet movements across 4 entire sectors of space. The Great Drathnull Battle Line, 300 ships strong, built on 3 centuries of proud tradition, did not move to stop them, because nothing in 300 years of their history had ever prepared them for an enemy who simply ignored the battle line completely. By the time their commanders understood what was actually happening around them, it was already far too late to call it a battle in the traditional sense. It had become something else, something quiet, cold, and terribly efficient. I remember turning to the young officer sitting beside me on the observation deck, a woman named Laura Bennett, and asking her a question that had been burning inside me since the ships first launched. I asked her, "Why does nobody seem afraid?" She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read at the time. It was not confidence. It was not arrogance either. It was something closer to certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from having already solved a problem long before anyone else even noticed it existed. She said, "We stopped being afraid the moment we understood the shape of the war." I did not understand what she meant. Not yet. But within the next few hours I would understand it completely, and it would change the way I looked at war for the rest of my life. The moment the human ships crossed into the corridor, every alarm on my console lit up at once. I had seen fleets move before, but never like this. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no ship drifting out of position while waiting for orders. It felt less like watching a battle and more like watching a single living creature reach out with 11 separate hands, each one knowing exactly what the others were doing without needing to ask. I turned to Laura Bennett again, unable to stop myself from asking more questions. I wanted to understand how a species with no history of interstellar war could move like this, with such confidence, against an enemy that had crushed civilizations far older and far larger than their own. She told me something I have never forgotten. She said her people had spent centuries fighting wars on their own world, long before they ever reached the stars. Those wars taught them something the coalition species had never needed to learn, because most of us had reached space peacefully, working together instead of against each other. Humanity's lessons had come from conflict, and one of the hardest lessons they ever learned was this: the side that wins a long war is rarely the side with the strongest army. It is the side that understands what keeps an army alive. I asked her what she meant by that. She said, food, fuel, medicine, spare parts, clean water, working engines. She said armies do not run on courage alone. They run on supply lines, and supply lines can be found, and supply lines can be broken. I remember feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. My people had studied this war for over a century. We had built entire academies dedicated to combat strategy, honor codes, fleet formations, and weapons technology. Nobody, not once in all that time, had built an entire strategy around something as simple and unglamorous as logistics. It felt almost insulting in its simplicity. And yet, watching those 11 human ships move toward the mining field with total certainty, I began to feel something else creeping into my chest. Not insult, fear. The good kind of fear, the kind that comes from finally understanding something important. The 11 ships reached the mining field within the hour. I expected an explosion, the kind of violent destruction I had witnessed 1,000 times over the course of this war. Instead, something quieter happened, something almost gentle by comparison, though its effects were anything but gentle. A pale blue light spread outward from the human ships, wrapping around the scattered rocks like a slow-moving fog. I later learned this was a specialized field designed to destabilize the internal structure of stored materials without triggering a violent chain reaction. The Drathnual had hidden nearly a century's worth of fuel reserves and weapon stockpiles inside that supposedly empty rock field, believing nobody would ever think to look there. The human field did not blow anything apart. It simply made the storage containers fall apart from the inside, slowly and silently, turning nearly 100 years of stockpiled war supplies into worthless dust. There was no explosion bright enough to see from a distance, no dramatic flash of destruction, just a quiet, steady collapse, like watching a great tower of sand slowly sink into itself. I sat there in complete silence, trying to process what I had just witnessed. An entire century of preparation, gone, without a single shot fired in its defense, because the enemy guarding it had never imagined anyone would find it in the first place. Meanwhile, the other 20 human ships had reached the communication relay station at the heart of the corridor. This was the moment I had been dreading since the mission began, because I expected the Drathnual's main battle line to finally react. And react they did, though not in the way I expected. 300 Drathnual warships, arranged in the same proud formation their ancestors had used for 3 centuries, began to turn as one enormous body. It was, I will admit, a beautiful sight in its own terrible way. Every ship moved with perfect discipline, perfect spacing, perfect timing. It looked like a living wall of steel, slowly rotating to face a new direction. But that beauty came with a cost, and it was a cost the humans understood far better than the Drathnual ever had. A formation that large, that disciplined, that dependent on perfect coordination, takes time to turn. Real time. Minutes that felt like hours. By the time the great Drathnual battle line had fully repositioned itself to defend the relay station, the human ships were no longer there. I watched Commander Daniel Ashford's voice come through on a shared communication channel, calm and steady, giving instructions that sounded almost too simple to matter. Strike and withdraw. Strike and withdraw. Do not engage the main line. Do not hold position. Let them chase shadows. It sounded almost cowardly to my ears at first. My people had been raised to believe that true strength meant standing your ground, meeting the enemy face to face, proving your courage through direct confrontation. The idea of striking a target and immediately retreating before the enemy could respond felt, at first, like something less than honorable. But then I watched the relay station go dark, its communication towers collapsing inward under the same kind of controlled, silent destruction I had seen at the mining field. And I understood, slowly and painfully, that courage was not the same thing as foolishness. The humans were not avoiding a fight because they were afraid. They were avoiding a fight they did not need to have. With the relay station destroyed, something remarkable happened across the entire Drathnual fleet. I watched their ships hesitate for the first time in the entire war. Not because they lacked courage, because they lacked information. Without their central relay, individual fleet commanders no longer knew what their neighboring fleets were doing, or where the enemy actually was, or what orders had been given in the last few minutes. 300 years of perfect coordination depended entirely on that single relay station, and it had just been quietly turned to dust. I asked Laura Bennett if this had all been planned from the very beginning, or if it was simply good fortune. She smiled, though there was no joy in it, only quiet exhaustion. She told me her people had studied the Drathnual for 6 years before ever sending a single ship into this war. 6 years of watching, recording, mapping supply routes, tracking communication patterns, learning the enemy's habits the way a careful hunter studies the movements of prey long before ever raising a weapon. I asked her why nobody in the coalition had ever thought to do the same thing. She said something that has stayed with me every day since. She said her people did not come from a history of easy victories. They came from a history of long, difficult struggles, where the strongest side did not always win, and where patience and preparation mattered more than raw power. She said the coalition species had reached the stars through cooperation, through peace, and that this had made them strong in many ways, but it had also left them without certain hard lessons that only conflict can teach. I did not know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to argue, to defend my people's history, to explain that peace was not a weakness, but another part of me, a quieter and more honest part, understood that she was not insulting us. She was simply telling the truth, the same way a doctor tells a patient an uncomfortable diagnosis, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. As the relay station's wreckage drifted silently through the corridor, I noticed something strange happening across the Drathnual battle line. Ships that had once moved as a single perfect body were now beginning to separate, each one falling back on old contingency plans that had never actually been tested in real combat, because no enemy had ever forced them to be tested before. For the first time in over a century, I watched the Drathnual fleet begin to fracture, not from an attack aimed directly at them, but from the simple, quiet removal of the thing that had always held them together. I turned to Laura Bennett one final time before the next stage of the operation began, and I asked her the question that had been building inside me since the moment I first arrived on this ship. I asked her, "Are you afraid of what happens next?" She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said fear was useful when it kept you cautious, but dangerous when it kept you from acting. She said her people had learned long ago that the greatest danger in any war was not the enemy in front of you. It was the fear that convinced you the enemy could never be beaten. I sat back in my chair, watching the wreckage of 100 years of preparation drift silently through space, and for the first time since this war began, I allowed myself to feel something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Hope, I would soon learn, is a fragile thing during a war, because the moment you allow yourself to feel it, you also open yourself up to a new kind of fear. The fear of losing something you finally believed you might get back. The Drathnual fleet split into 11 separate groups, each one now operating under old emergency plans that had been written decades earlier and never truly tested in real battle. I watched their formations drift apart on my screen, no longer a single disciplined body, but 11 smaller fleets, each uncertain of what the others were doing, each cut off from the central coordination they had relied on for centuries. I expected the humans to press their advantage immediately, to strike hard while the enemy was confused and disorganized. That is what my own people would have done. That is what every coalition commander I had ever studied would have done. Strike while the enemy is weak. Finish the fight quickly, before they have a chance to recover. Instead, Admiral Whitfield gave an order that confused me deeply at the time. She told her fleet to let them run. I remember staring at the communication screen, waiting for a follow-up order that made more sense, some explanation of a trap I simply could not see yet. None came. The human ships did not chase the scattered Drathnual fleets. They did not attempt to destroy them while they were vulnerable. They simply held their position near the corridor, watching, waiting, as if the fight itself was no longer the point. I asked Laura Bennett why her admiral would allow the enemy fleets to escape when they were at their weakest. She explained it to me slowly, the way someone explains something they have known for so long that they forget it is not obvious to everyone else. She said destroying those 11 fleets would take time, resources, and lives, both human and Drathnual. It would also give the Drathnual something they desperately needed in that moment, something that could rally their people and unite them again. It would give them a battle to remember, a story of resistance against overwhelming odds, the kind of story that could inspire an entire species to keep fighting for another century. She said her admiral had no interest in giving them that story. Instead, humanity's plan was far quieter and far more permanent. Without their supply depot and without their communication relay, those 11 scattered Drathnual fleets now had a serious problem, one that no amount of courage or discipline could solve. They were 3 sectors away from their nearest resupply point, carrying only a handful of days' worth of fuel, food, and working equipment. Every ship in those 11 fleets was now racing against a clock that none of their commanders fully understood yet. I watched the human fleet quietly reposition itself, not to attack the fleeing Drathnull ships, but to block every remaining path back toward their supply lines. It was not a wall of ships meeting them head-on. It was something far more subtle, a series of small, fast vessels, positioned at key points along known travel routes, watching, waiting, ready to intercept only if absolutely necessary. Commander Daniel Ashford explained the strategy to me directly during a brief pause in the operation, and I will try to repeat his words as closely as I remember them. He said the goal was never to destroy the Drathnull fleet in a single afternoon. The goal was to make continuing this war impossible for them, without forcing either side to lose thousands of lives in the process. He said a beaten enemy who still believes they can win will keep fighting forever, but an enemy who understands, clearly and completely, that victory is no longer possible, will eventually choose to stop fighting on their own. I asked him if he believed the Drathnull would actually make that choice. He said it did not matter what he believed, it only mattered what was true, and the truth, laid out clearly on every fuel gauge and supply record across those 11 scattered fleets, was becoming impossible to ignore. Over the following hours, I watched something unfold that I had never witnessed in over a century of war. Drathnull commanders, faced with dwindling fuel and no clear communication with their central command, began making decisions entirely on their own, something their strict honor code had never truly prepared them for. Some fleets attempted to push forward toward the front lines anyway, hoping to reach friendly territory before their supplies ran out completely. Others turned back immediately, choosing caution over pride, for what may have been the first time in their military history. One fleet, the largest of the 11, made a decision that surprised everyone watching, myself included. Rather than attempting to escape or push forward, they turned directly toward the nearest human vessel and opened a communication channel. I was allowed to listen to that exchange, and I do not think I will ever forget it. The Drathnull commander's voice was proud, even in defeat, carrying the weight of 3 centuries of tradition behind every word. He asked why the humans had not simply destroyed his fleet when they had the clear opportunity to do so. He said his people expected an honorable death in battle, not this slow, humiliating collapse of everything they had built their lives around. Admiral Whitfield's response came through calm and steady, without a hint of triumph in her voice. She told him that her people did not measure honor by how many lives were lost in a single afternoon. She told him that a war fought purely for pride, with no consideration for the cost, was not honorable at all. It was simply waste, dressed up in prettier language. The Drathnull commander was silent for a long moment before responding. He said his people had fought this war for 3 centuries, believing that strength and discipline alone would eventually decide its outcome. He asked, quietly, what humanity believed would decide it instead. Admiral Whitfield's answer was simple, and it has stayed with me every day since I first heard it. She said patience, understanding, and the willingness to see the whole battlefield, not just the part directly in front of you. I sat there on the observation deck, listening to this exchange between 2 commanders from entirely different worlds, and I felt something shift deep inside me. For over a century, my people had believed that this war could only end one of 2 ways: total victory or total destruction. Nobody had ever considered a third option, an ending built not on the battlefield itself, but on the quiet, careful understanding of everything that supported it. As the hours passed, more Drathnull fleets began opening similar communication channels, each one facing the same impossible choice between running out of fuel in open space or turning back toward territory that was no longer fully under their control. I watched proud commanders, trained from birth to value honor above all else, slowly come to terms with a truth that no battle had ever taught them. Sometimes the strongest move available is not to fight harder, it is to recognize when fighting harder no longer serves any real purpose. Laura Bennett sat beside me during much of this, quietly monitoring her own console, occasionally explaining details I did not fully understand. I asked her how her people had learned to think this way, to see an entire war as something that could be solved rather than simply fought. She told me a story about her own history, one small piece of a much longer human past. She said her people once fought wars that lasted for generations, wars that consumed entire nations before finally ending, not always through decisive battles, but often through the slow, quiet collapse of a side's ability to continue fighting at all. She said humanity had learned, sometimes at a terrible cost, that wars are rarely won purely through strength. They are won through understanding exactly what keeps both sides standing and knowing precisely where that foundation is weakest. I asked her if she believed this war, the one that had consumed my people for over a century, could truly end today. She looked at the display in front of her, watching fuel levels drop steadily across 11 scattered Drathnual fleets, and she said something I will never forget. She said wars do not end when one side runs out of ships. They end when one side finally understands that continuing to fight no longer makes any sense at all. She said today, for the first time in a very long time, that understanding was finally within reach. I looked out at the quiet wreckage still drifting through the Thren corridor, the remains of 100 years of preparation now scattered uselessly across empty space, and I allowed myself, for just a moment, to imagine a future my people had stopped believing in a long time ago. A future where this war was simply something that happened once, a painful chapter that eventually closed, rather than an endless story with no final page. I did not yet know how close that future truly was. The largest of the 11 scattered fleets, the one whose commander had already spoken directly with Admiral Whitfield, made its final decision just under 4 hours after the operation began. I watched their ships power down their weapons systems entirely and begin a slow, careful retreat toward Drathnual territory, no longer attempting to reach the front lines at all. It was the first time in the recorded history of this war that a Drathnual fleet had willingly chosen retreat over confrontation, without first being forced into it through direct combat. I expected celebration among the human crew when this happened. Instead, I found something quieter, something closer to focused determination than triumph. Commander Daniel Ashford moved calmly between different stations, checking reports, confirming positions, making certain that no opportunity was being wasted and no unnecessary risk was being taken. There was no cheering, no excitement, just steady, careful work, as if this entire operation was simply another task to be completed properly, rather than a historic turning point worth celebrating loudly. I asked Laura Bennett why her people seemed so calm in a moment that felt, to me, like one of the greatest victories in the history of this war. She told me that celebrating too early was dangerous, because it could lead to mistakes born from overconfidence. She said her people preferred to finish a task completely before allowing themselves to feel any real sense of accomplishment. I found this strange at first, but the longer I sat there watching her work, the more I began to understand the wisdom in it. Not every Drathnual fleet chose to retreat peacefully. 3 of the 11 scattered fleets attempted something far more desperate. Rather than turning back or opening communication, they pushed forward at maximum speed, hoping to break through toward the front lines before their remaining fuel ran out entirely. I understood immediately why they made this choice. For 3 centuries, retreat had been treated as a failure of honor within Drathnual military culture. For some commanders, the idea of surviving through retreat felt far worse than risking destruction through one final, desperate push forward. This was the moment I had been quietly dreading since the operation began, because I finally understood what would happen if those 3 fleets refused to stop. Admiral Whitfield gave new orders, and for the first time since the operation started, I heard something firmer in her voice, though still nothing close to anger or excitement. She ordered a small group of human ships to move into position along the most direct path those 3 fleets were taking toward the front lines, not to destroy them, but to make continuing forward completely impossible without triggering a direct and unavoidable confrontation. I asked Daniel Ashford what would happen if the 3 fleets refused to stop even now. He told me something that surprised me deeply. He said his people had already run detailed simulations of exactly this scenario, days before the operation ever began. He said if those fleets refused every opportunity to retreat peacefully, human ships were prepared to disable their engines directly, using precise, controlled strikes designed to stop a ship without destroying it completely. He said the goal, even now, even after everything that had already happened, was still to end this war with as few lives lost as absolutely necessary. I found myself struggling to fully accept this. My people had spent over a century believing that war meant destruction, that victory always came at the cost of countless lives on both sides. The idea that an enemy fleet could be stopped, truly stopped, without being destroyed entirely, felt almost impossible to believe, even as I watched it happening directly in front of me. The first of the 3 desperate fleets reached the human blocking position roughly 5 hours after the operation began. I held my breath, waiting for the violence I had witnessed so many times before during this endless war. Instead, I watched something far more controlled unfold. Small, fast human vessels moved in precise formation around the lead Drathnual ships, using focused energy strikes aimed exclusively at engine systems and weapons arrays, carefully avoiding anything that would risk the lives of the crews inside. Within minutes, the lead ships of that fleet drifted to a complete stop, their engines disabled, their weapons offline, but their crews entirely unharmed. The remaining ships in that fleet, seeing their commanders disabled rather than destroyed, made their own choice almost immediately. They powered down their weapons and opened a communication channel, requesting terms rather than continuing to fight a battle they now understood, completely and finally, that they could not win. The second desperate fleet, watching this unfold from a distance through what remained of their scattered communication network, made the same choice without even needing to reach the blocking position themselves. They simply stopped, turned, and began their own retreat, choosing to accept defeat with whatever honor remained, rather than face the same fate as the fleet before them. The third fleet was different. Their commander, a proud and stubborn officer, whose name I would later learn was never actually recorded in any surviving Drathnual records, refused every attempt at communication. He pushed his ships forward at maximum speed, apparently determined to force a direct confrontation regardless of the consequences. I watched this unfold with a knot of tension building in my chest, uncertain of how this final confrontation would end. Admiral Whitfield gave her orders calmly, without hesitation, without any visible anger toward a commander who seemed determined to throw away his own crew's lives for the sake of pride alone. The human ships moved into a tight formation directly in the path of the oncoming fleet, close enough to make their intentions absolutely clear, but still holding their fire, still offering one final opportunity for surrender before anything irreversible happened. The Drathnual commander did not take that opportunity. His lead ship opened fire first, and for the first time since the operation began, I watched real combat unfold, direct and immediate, rather than the careful, distant maneuvering I had witnessed throughout the rest of the day. The human ships responded with precision I had never seen from any fleet in over a century of this war. Every strike aimed carefully at engines, weapons systems, and communication arrays, deliberately avoiding anything that would risk unnecessary loss of life among the crews inside. Within 11 minutes, every ship in that final fleet had been disabled, their weapons silenced, their engines destroyed, but not a single life lost on either side. The stubborn commander's own vessel was the last to fall silent, drifting powerlessly in open space, defeated completely, but somehow, remarkably, still intact. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just witnessed. An entire fleet, one that had chosen violence over surrender, defeated completely within minutes, with every life aboard still breathing, still alive, still able to see whatever came next. I asked Laura Bennett how her people had managed to develop this level of precision, this ability to disable an enemy fleet so completely without the widespread destruction I had witnessed throughout every other battle of this long, painful war. She told me it came from decades of careful research, technology developed specifically to end conflicts as quickly and cleanly as possible, built by people who understood, perhaps better than any other species in the coalition, exactly how much unnecessary suffering war could cause when nobody bothered to look for a better way. I looked out at the drifting wreckage of that final Drathnual fleet, disabled but not destroyed, and I felt something I had not felt in over a century of watching this war unfold. Not triumph, not celebration, something quieter, and in many ways far more powerful. Relief. For the first time since I could remember, I allowed myself to believe that this war might truly be reaching its final chapter, not through the total destruction either side had always assumed was inevitable, but through something far more difficult and far more meaningful: understanding. 5 hours had passed since the first human ship crossed into the Thren corridor, and I sat there on the observation deck trying to understand how something that had consumed my entire life, and the lives of countless generations before me, could unravel so completely in such a short amount of time. It did not feel real. It felt like watching a dream that I was terrified to wake up from, afraid that if I closed my eyes, I would open them again, to find the war exactly as it had always been. The final Drathnual commander, the stubborn one whose fleet had been disabled rather than destroyed, requested a direct communication channel with Admiral Whitfield shortly after his ships fell silent. I was permitted to listen, though I do not think anyone truly expected what was about to happen. His voice, when it finally came through, sounded nothing like the proud, unshakable commanders I had grown accustomed to hearing throughout this long war. It sounded tired, confused, almost lost. He asked Admiral Whitfield why she had chosen to spare his life, when every tradition within his own culture would have expected total destruction as the natural result of refusing surrender. He said he had spent his entire career believing that mercy shown to an enemy was itself a kind of weakness, a sign that the side offering it did not fully understand the seriousness of war. Admiral Whitfield's response came through steady and calm, without a trace of superiority in her voice. She told him that mercy was not weakness. She said mercy, when offered from a position of genuine strength, was one of the most powerful things any side in a conflict could offer, because it proved beyond doubt that victory did not require cruelty to be meaningful. She said her people had learned that a war ended through understanding tends to stay ended, while a war ended purely through destruction often leaves behind bitterness that eventually grows into an entirely new conflict, sometimes generations later. The Drathnual commander was silent for a long moment before responding. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something I had never expected to hear from any officer of his rank and reputation: genuine curiosity. He asked what would happen next, now that his fleet had been defeated so completely, yet so strangely without bloodshed. Admiral Whitfield told him the truth, plainly and without hesitation. She said her people had no interest in conquering Drathnual territory, no interest in humiliating a defeated enemy beyond what was already necessary to end the war itself. She said the goal from the very beginning had never been destruction for its own sake. The goal had always been to remove the ability to continue fighting, nothing more and nothing less. I listened to this exchange with a growing sense of disbelief, because everything about it contradicted everything I had ever been taught about how wars were supposed to end. Total victory, total surrender, total control over whatever remained of the defeated side. That was the pattern every coalition species had followed throughout our own history, whenever we had been strong enough to enforce it. The idea of achieving complete victory and then choosing restraint, choosing understanding over domination, felt almost foreign to everything I understood about conflict. Within the following hour, word of what had happened in the Thren corridor began spreading rapidly across the wider war. Drathnual commanders stationed along other fronts, hearing reports of their supply lines collapsing and their most disciplined fleets falling without the total destruction they had always expected from defeat, began requesting communication with coalition forces for the first time in over a century. I sat in on several of these exchanges over the following hours, watching proud, stubborn commanders slowly come to terms with a truth that no single battle had ever managed to teach them throughout 300 years of conflict. Their strength had always depended entirely on a foundation nobody had ever thought to examine closely: supply lines, communication networks, the quiet, unglamorous systems that kept an army fed, informed, and coordinated. And that foundation, once properly understood, was far more fragile than any battle line had ever been. By the time 6 full hours had passed since the operation began, representatives from the Drathnul Ascendancy formally requested a ceasefire across the entire war, the first such request in over a century of continuous conflict. I remember sitting completely still when the news reached our ship, unable to fully process what I was hearing. A war that had consumed my entire life, and the lives of countless generations before me, was finally, genuinely, coming to an end. I found Laura Bennett shortly after the announcement, sitting quietly at her station, reviewing final reports from the operation with the same calm focus she had shown throughout the entire day. I asked her if she felt proud of what her people had accomplished. She considered the question carefully before answering, the way someone answers when they want to be completely honest rather than simply saying what feels expected of them. She said pride felt like the wrong word for what she was feeling. She said what she felt was closer to relief, mixed with a quiet kind of sadness, because ending a war, even successfully, still meant acknowledging just how much unnecessary suffering had occurred before anyone finally found a better way forward. I asked her if she believed this war could have ended sooner, if only someone had thought to approach it differently a century earlier. She told me she believed it probably could have, though she was careful to say this without any judgment toward the coalition species who had fought so long and so hard, using the only methods available to them at the time. She said every side in this war had been doing the best they understood how to do, based on the history and experience each species carried into the conflict. She said her people had simply carried a different kind of history, one shaped by different lessons, and that difference had allowed them to see something the rest of us had missed for over 100 years. I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over carefully in my mind. I thought about the countless lives lost throughout this war, generation after generation, believing there was no alternative to endless, grinding conflict. I thought about how strange and painful it felt to realize that a different approach had existed the entire time, waiting quietly to be discovered by whoever finally thought to look for it. Commander Daniel Ashford found me sitting alone on the observation deck several hours later, staring out at the quiet wreckage still drifting through what remained of the Thren corridor. He sat down beside me without saying anything at first, giving me time to process everything that had happened. Eventually, I asked him a question that had been building inside me since the very beginning of the operation. I asked him if his people had known, truly known, that this plan would work before they ever put it into action. He told me they had known it would probably work, based on years of careful preparation and study, but that no plan involving other living, thinking beings could ever be guaranteed with absolute certainty. He said there had always been a chance that the Drathnul would choose destruction over surrender at every single decision point throughout the entire operation. He said his people had prepared for that possibility as carefully as they had prepared for the outcome that actually occurred. I asked him how it felt to succeed in ending a war that had seemed impossible to end for over a century. He was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something I recognized immediately, because I had felt the exact same thing myself throughout that long, remarkable day. Not triumph, not pride in the way I had always imagined victory would feel, something quieter and somehow far more meaningful. He said it felt like finally putting down something heavy that nobody should have had to carry for so long in the first place. I sat with him in silence after that, watching the slow drift of wreckage through space, remnants of 100 years of preparation and conflict that had finally, quietly, come to an end. I thought about everything I had witnessed throughout those 5 extraordinary hours. The quiet collapse of a hidden supply depot nobody had ever thought to search properly. The careful, patient destruction of a communication relay that held together an entire military tradition built on perfect coordination. The precise, restrained defeat of stubborn fleets who had refused every opportunity to surrender peacefully, disabled completely, yet spared entirely. I thought about Admiral Claire Whitfield's calm, steady voice throughout every difficult decision, never once raising in anger or triumph, always focused entirely on ending suffering rather than proving strength for its own sake. I thought about Laura Bennett's quiet explanations, patient even with someone from a species that had spent over a century failing to see what her people had understood from the very beginning. I thought about Daniel Ashford's careful, measured leadership, and the strange, quiet weight in his voice, when he described victory, not as triumph, but as relief. I am writing this account now, several days after the ceasefire was formally signed, sitting in the same observation deck, where I witnessed everything unfold. I know there will be other accounts written about this day, some far more dramatic than mine, filled with descriptions of unstoppable human warriors and legendary victories that will grow more exaggerated with each retelling over the years to come. I understand why those stories will exist. They are simpler, and in many ways more satisfying, than the truth. But the truth, the one I witnessed with my own eyes throughout those 5 remarkable hours, is both smaller and far more important than any legend could ever be. Humanity did not win this war because they were stronger than every species that came before them. They won because for over a century, none of us had ever stopped to ask a simple, obvious question. Not where is the strongest point in the enemy's battle line, but where is the weakest point in everything that holds it together. They found that answer quietly, patiently, over 6 years of careful observation that nobody else had ever bothered to conduct. And in doing so, they ended a war that generations of my own people had come to believe would simply never end. I do not know what comes next for the coalition, or for the Draftnul, or for the strange, quiet species that finally taught all of us something we should have learned a century ago. But for the first time in my entire life, I find myself looking toward the future without the heavy, familiar weight of endless war pressing down on every single thought. And for that, whatever else history eventually decides to say about this day, I will always be grateful.